Great. Thank you both so much. And for Doctors Tignanelli and Hansen, can you please give your thoughts on the role of the legal system and your use of AI tools in your practice? Does the specter of medical malpractice concern you or not?
Sure, I'm happy to go. It definitely concerns us. There it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like we've used risk prediction models or like scoring systems. You get 2 points if you have this, you get 3 points if you have this, and if you have more than 7 points, you need XYZ treatment, something like that. They've done that in medicine for a long time. AI is just the next generation of that. The reality is that, using these systems is kind of already embedded in medicine. And the reality is that a lot of AI systems are coming out and they're getting approved. And there hasn't been a lot of clinical trials yet in AI. But there's like a JAMA open paper that showed, I think, like 40 something. This is a couple of years ago, so there's probably more, but so maybe there's 100 clinical trials in AI. But the reality is that eventually AI systems are going to become standard of care. And then the risk that I worry about is like, what do you do if either your system doesn't buy the AI system because the health system's like, oh, it's too expensive, we're not going to buy it, and then a patient has a harm. Is the system liable because you didn't give them optimal care, so you didn't have access to that system? Or if you do, you get the AI system and you don't follow the AI system's prediction, what liability are you taking? Because AI is not going to be perfect. You're never going to see an AI system with an AU rock of 1.0 and 100% accuracy. So, what happens when we, the clinician, disagree with the AI and we're pretty confident that we're right? How do you go about doing that, and how do you mitigate your risk there? So those are the pieces I really worry about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again, it's important to think about this along the spectrum that we have had forms of AI for a very long time. So some of the very basic tenets we've used for a long time still hold. And I think the thing with the more, modern AI systems is that the risk of automation bias becomes greater and greater. But that's existed for a long time. So it's very important to make sure that we are training, educating our clinicians about the risk of automation bias, and then also, just good documentation around why you have adopted the recommendations, the output of the system.
Great. Thank you both. And that's a nice segue into my next question. Dr. Hansen, you've alluded many times as to how long AI has been around, and Mark Gardner opened us up talking about this. And if I recall from my training time, there was a discussion of these subcategories of these models. And it's my recollection that AI has truthfully been around since the 1950s. So my next question is for Nate. It's a data question. What do you think the tipping point has been in the data community that has created such a hubbub around AI today? And why did healthcare suddenly adopt it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's been around, but the capabilities to be able to take all those data and integrate with complex algorithms and have the individuals with knowledge creating the systems and many companies doing it. So there's iterative work that goes on where people build off each other. That's increasing. And so, talking about what has changed with the data, I think there's just so much data that's constantly collected, right? If you take and implant a type of stimulator, for example, um, some of these stimulators are taking data on a constant basis of the spinal cord's reaction, for example, to stimulation and the output that's given. And so, yes, there's always been data in the 1950s, but you have millions of data points every day in a single patient right now. And so you just have more access to greater amounts of data that you can now run through these complex algorithms. And now you can show FDA, like, this is the data set I'm going to use. This is the algorithm that's going to be used to put whatever output we need. And here's the confines. And so I don't know if it's a tipping point necessarily. It's just you've gotten to a point now where you can show enough verification and validation on these AI-enabled devices that people can adopt them, adopt them on a large scale. Whereas, I mean, I don't want to speak for the 1950s, but there probably just wasn't the systems in place, right, to be able to say, hey, let's predict where this patient's spine is going to end up after this exact implant based on this model is put into the spine. So I don't want to skirt the question, but I don't think it's a tipping point. I think it's a building and it's a governmental confidence, and the FDA has experts, and there's enough industry investing in it because it's not easy to invest in a medical device. And so all those combinations combined with the computing capabilities allow us to, start to see more and more treatment with AI-enabled devices.
Yeah, we used to live in a data limited world. Now we live in a hypothesis limited world, don't we? And we have so much data, it's become so much more affordable. It's become more accessible. Great. I have a question here that came in from the audience, and I'm going to direct this one to Kelly. So the question asker says, my organization moves slowly into AI, and we're a smaller organization. So we're told that we need to evaluate AI for various things, including efficacy and bias. But as a smaller organization, we're not going to necessarily be able to just get that answer directly from the vendor who's providing the system. How are we going to make those evaluations, particularly in the realm of bias? How would we look at a framework to do that?
Yeah, I think that's obviously a concern, and your limited resources will always play into the ability to make those decisions. I think we I think that there are models out there that can be used to help figure that out. What to be on the lookout for, how to look at the data sort of more broadly, and to say, we want to, sort of to Dr. Hansen's point earlier, we want to make sure that we're looking at a broader set of people rather than just a small subset of people who may have, kind of like in any sort of valid scientific study, you always want to make sure you're having a diverse group to look at. I think if the question is resources, I think one thing I would suggest is leaning in on your like the Minnesota Health Associate or Minnesota Hospital Association, or other sort of national groups that might have sort of like toolboxes for you to use and to consider. I think, I often will talk to my peers in other healthcare systems to kind of get a sense of what they're doing or how they've been doing it. I don't know, Dr. Hansen, if you have any suggestions too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I kind of mentioned those different frameworks in my talk. I think looking at the NIST framework, for example, could be very helpful. And then, also check out the group CHAI, the Coalition for Health AI. They also have a nice framework and a lot of material, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch on these. And then I'd also say I would really encourage you to have these conversations with the vendors. I was on the vendor side, developing these types of systems for many years. We are very used to getting these types of questions and questionnaires. And your vendor should have people who do this, who fill out these forms. And if they aren't willing to do that or don't have answers to these questions, that would be a big red flag. So you can oftentimes just stop your evaluation right there if the vendor is not willing to have these discussions with you or has no answer to your questions.
One thing to also piggyback on that. So one of my other hats is I'm one of the co-chairs of mHealth Fairview's AI Oversight Committee. So we oversee all the vendor integrations that we do. A lot of times the vendors will let you can take a subset of your data and run it on the model and then see how does it actually perform, their solution in your patients. So that might, and if you don't have the resources to do that, I guess the other thing you could do is at least maybe not be the earliest adopter, let other institutions that do have those resources do that, and then also reach out to them, be like, hey, how did it work on your patients, et cetera. Because then at least you could get that kind of validation done. Because it's really important to make sure that it actually works like locally in the population that you're going to be deploying it on. Like Epic deployed their sepsis AI model and they only developed that on like 3 hospitals across the country, and then it got implemented 100+ hospitals. And then people sat down and looked at it, they found it didn't perform anywhere near how it performed at the 3 original hospitals. So you really got to do that due diligence on your own patients before implementing any solutions.
That's great advice. Taking a subsample never hurts, right? And I imagine that would be another red flag if a vendor wouldn't allow you to run a test drive with some of your own data.
I would definitely see that as a flag. Yeah, and again, if you don't have the resources to, I'd ask them for a few reference customers and talk to the reference customers who've been using it.
Great. I always love getting vendor references.
Yeah.
Um, all right. The next question I have could be taken as a device question or a product question or a software question. So I'll throw it out there and ask Nate to start, but anyone else, please continue to jump in. This is so helpful. What are the biggest challenges and oversight of AI tools once they've been adapted within provider organizations or other areas of the healthcare sector that you've seen?
Yeah, so the ongoing change, I think, is one that's always difficult. I talked about there's some regulatory tools you can use to get in front. It's also a lot of tools will start as one thing, right? And they'll be classified as whatever that one thing is. And then, sometimes providers want to use it differently, the way that it's even maybe promoted, which, is not supposed to happen, but, sometimes sales reps will kind of see the broad capabilities and promote it there as well. And so it can become a different type of classification. You could have an adulterated device in AI very easily if you don't have a very strong change control plan. And physicians not regulated by FDA, but certainly industry and the device itself is regulated by FDA. And so if you are going to, have a kind of a lax change control plan and, people get really excited about their AI devices as they should, and the potential capabilities, but you could end up in the marketplace, with an adulterated device and not really have oversight and some of the answers that FDA might request when they see these capabilities unlocked are not always easy to have, right? Because those are going to take more data and more submissions potentially. So I would say being able to stick within whatever your approval, whatever your clearance is and your pre-controlled plan is the best way. And it's not always easy, especially as physicians or researchers get a hold of it and they see that the broad use case is it's much bigger than you're able to market for. And so being able to stick in line and make sure that you follow the appropriate steps for study and approval of new indications or whatever it might be, is imperative, but it's not always easy, especially from a business perspective.
Yeah, on the oversight piece, another thing that I'm really worried about is like the FDA requires that all of these like software as a medical devices have a monitoring plan, like a continuous monitoring plan. But we work with a lot of these vendors, and they've told us that they don't have access to the data. So once they sell it to a couple of health systems, the health systems start deploying it. They don't have access to the data from those health systems, so they don't know how it's performing at those hospitals. So we really question like what is going on with like how are these vendors actually monitoring their devices? And the requirement is just that they, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, but my understanding is the requirement is just that they have a monitoring program. It doesn't have any metrics on, how often they have to check or what is part of that monitoring plan.
No, you're right.
And
It's a special control,
yeah,
but it can be very, very general. Some companies are savvy and they'll get access to the data in their agreements and, but once again, that's expensive and it takes a lot of work. So if you can just say we'll monitor, and sometimes it's as simple as, we'll follow up on adverse events. That's part of monitoring too. And so there is not a specific way. We'll kind of go to the EU for a second. The EU has a very specific, depending on the classification of the device, post-market plan for follow-up that you lay out basically a clinical study, and there isn't that in the FDA. And so the monitoring might be as simple as if we hear about something, we'll deal with it and we'll kind of track events that occur. And if they get to a certain number, then we'll consider whether we need a device change or a labeling change or what it might take to, get up to speed. But there isn't a very strong post-market
Hmm.
framework that they're going to be able to follow. And if they don't get the access to the data and they don't contract for that, or there's certain exceptions, Paul would know way better than I do about getting those data, then they're really, what are they monitoring for? The mod database, which isn't super helpful. So to Dr. Tignanelli's point, they might be monitoring, but what exactly signals are they able to pick up? It could be very minimal.
Yeah, so ARPA-H worked with the FDA, and we don't know if we'll still have ARPA-H, but there's a program out right now called Entrust AI. It's funded at like $200 million, and they accepted proposals. We put one in, but the whole goal is developing kind of a national framework to monitor AI for software as a medical device solutions deployed across multiple hospitals. So essentially, they want to deploy 4 AI models as kind of their test cases, and then all those models would send information centrally to a platform that tracks model performance over time. And when a 5% degradation in model performance is detected, it then has a whole bunch of stuff that tries to identify why did the model fail, et cetera. But that's kind of a whole program that is being hashed out right now. And we don't know if that'll actually get funded or not now, but yeah.
Yeah, well, ARPA-H is an incredible pathway to rapid innovation. So good luck with your application. Hopefully, you'll hear good news. I'm going to let Marty Stillman, who has their hand up, take the next question for the panel.
Thank you. Brita, great job. Nice to see you again. So another area that hasn't been touched upon much, but I want to know what you're seeing with this is I do some work in the wellness space, and we're using the DAX, the Dragon Ambient Experience, of using AI to help with note taking for providers. So it's just a whole nother area of AI that is patient care related, but looking at some of the efficiencies that we can gain and help with wellness and reducing burnout. Have you had experience with that, either yourself or at the university?
Yeah. Good to hear from you, Marty. Yeah, we are using at Alina, we're using DAX as well. And I think every major system in town is using some version of this. I know Fairview's using a different one. But yeah, I think that is, so kind of setting aside the medical device aspect of AI, I think really the vast majority of things we're using at Alina are really looking at the efficiency side of things. So when you go back to kind of the use cases I outlined in the talk, I think documentation is probably one of the most widely adopted functions. Again, I think every place in town is using something already now. I use it every day in my clinical practice, and I love it, and you could not take it away from me. And I think similarly, when I talked about kind of chart summarization, synthesizing, surfacing data for clinicians, I mean, similar to the example Mark gave early on about, the ability to sift through massive amounts of images really quickly. We do the same thing with a lot of chart summarization tools, and we have a few different innovations partnerships going on with some vendors now where we're just looking at this ability for AI to really sift through just this massive quantity of data in the health record, not only our local health record, but also connections it has to, outside health records and other, other documents as well that a human being just takes forever. I mean, think about all the chart prep we do before going into a room, or we historically have done. And we really can leverage AI to cut down that time. But again, still keeping the human clinician very much in the loop to have oversight of what's being surfaced and what's being documented, all of those things.
I agree. Thank you.
I would also say, just on top of that, making sure that you read your dictated note is always a good thing from the documented standpoint, because sometimes these tools don't always accurately translate our speech.
Yes.
Excellent. So I have one more question here from the audience that's been sent in. What role does patient input or feedback have as AI continues to be developed and adopted across all health systems? It's a great segue.
Yeah, I'll go first from a FDA medical device standpoint, FDA does have panels where patients are invited to come in and provide feedback, give input. They want to take patient feedback into account for the decisions they make. But more pointedly, if you are developing a medical device or anything AI medical product that is going to be utilized by patients, you need to run certain studies sometimes usability studies, depending on the risk of the device and how it works, where you're going to enroll part of your standard patient population and have them use the device and ensure that it can be safely and effectively used. And so if you have a over-the-counter device example, and I don't know if there's a lot of over-the-counter AI devices yet, but I imagine there will, right? That'll be considered. And so from an FDA perspective, if you want to have a broad use case and you want patients, sometimes it's just programming or something, you're going to have to consider those into your design, into your AI design, into your privacy by design, into your security by design, and make sure you are building those use case scenarios in and getting patient input from a validated study where possible.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as a litigator, I think, you always want to make sure you're getting your patient's buy-in and to help kind of as you're doing things, maybe just explain what you're doing as a physician, just so that they know, and it sort of demystifies everything. I think people don't trust what they don't know. And so being able to have that transparency, I think is really important.
Thank you both. I have another question here that's been sent in for Dr. Hansen. How has your organization been handling and reviewing general productivity AI tools where the tool's intended use is not for high-risk clinical use? I feel like we just went over this actually. Maybe I could have stricken this one out. So with the productivity tools, then let's build upon this question. How does your review group that you had mentioned still review all of those against your framework, or do they still review against those framework just for the productivity tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think the same principles hold no matter which of these tools we're talking about. And so again, a lot of these, as we already touched on, the big issue is really human clinician supervision of them. So whether it be what Kelly was mentioning, that you need to review your documentation and understand that that is your documentation once it goes out there in the world, and just being sure that that education and that there's actually the proper opportunity for the clinician to oversee it. So, and then if it's more of a clinical decision support tool, where where is it that the output is being presented to the clinician, and can they make the right, have the opportunity to make the decision at the right time, for example. So I think it's the same framework. Almost all of these things continue to come up, no matter if you're talking about a more of a diagnostic tool or more of a productivity tool.
Yeah, I can expand at least on what we're doing at Fairview. When we deploy these, we look at, let's say it's one that replies to a patient message and like pre-writes an email or response to a patient, or the scribe one. We look at how often, like how many words or characters does the physician change. And then we also ask them after every time the physician uses it to give like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So this is just some of the like the metrics that we kind of look at.
That's really helpful. I have one more from the audience here, and I love this question. I used to work in rare diseases clinical research. How is AI being used in the rare diseases space for diagnosis, research, and treatment development in the small, rarer populations?
Less than in the larger populations, like a lot less. One of the problems is that with rare events, that's tricky for AI because you don't have as much training data. So you really need data from a large amount of institutions to train those models. I'm a trauma surgeon, so in the trauma space, there's some very rare trauma diseases like aortic injury and things like that that don't happen a lot, but when they happen, it's a big deal. So there's no models for those yet, but there are initial groupings of people getting together and pulling data so that you get enough cases from a lot of hospitals. So I'd say, I don't know, it's maybe 5, 10 years behind where at least in trauma, the more common trauma diagnostic and treatment systems were being developed just because we had a lot of cases of them.
Sounds like that would be a great question to pose to the National Trauma Registries, state trauma registries, and then in the case more directed towards the question, even the rare disease consortia that exist for those particular groups.
I would say too, when you think about from an FDA perspective and industry going to FDA, you don't see a lot of AI in humanitarian devices or used in orphan drug development. And, I think Dr. Tignanelli hit it. There's not a lot of data, but also, sadly, there's not always a lot of money in rare diseases. So the investment that's required to get an AI device on market when you're not sure, A, you're going to have the data to continually improve that device, and then B, you don't exactly know what your return is, does also limit, some of the industry investment. FDA accounts for that in some of the regulations and laws around treating rare diseases and getting treatment options for rare diseases, but it still doesn't account for some of those issues from a funding standpoint. And it's just, I know it's not an easy one, but that is part of the reality too when it comes to getting those treatments on the market.
Thanks for those added points. Here's a question that is probably directed towards Kelly. From a legal discovery and business continuity perspective, how do record retention schedules fit into the use of adaptive or generative AI formats? And I was wondering about this in terms of the point that you made when you were responding to a previous question, or it might have been in your talk about not having a mirror image of the record back in time.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the more challenging areas. I think, what you will probably have to retain are documents surrounding the creation of the algorithm and how the algorithm was created, but the outputs will not be able to be recreated. I think that is going to be, I think, something that's going to be exceptionally challenging. I think, when we think about discovery, we think about, you don't want to have spoliation arguments or something like that, like you deliberately, didn't preserve something you should have preserved. In this case, I would argue that it's almost unpreservable, that the expanse of it is so massive and so so evolving that to pick out a specific period in time to retain something is an impossibility. And obviously, I'd like to think about that a little bit more, but I think in terms of, when we would talk about retention schedules and things like that, we always were talking in historical terms of, paper documents. You're going to keep this for 7 years and then it gets thrown. I think when we're dealing with such digital and sort of evolving technology, it's going to be a real challenge to come up with something that's, you will have to maybe go to the origin source as opposed to the final output.
It sounds like we're iterating on the problems that we saw decades ago around the lack of reproducible research. Now we're not able to really prove our trail to those outcomes again with this new technology. Thank you. So Dr. Hansen, you've talked everybody today has talked a lot about CDS as one of the biggest areas of adoption. Obviously, clinical documentation, AI has saved all of us, but particularly in the provider space. What do you all see as what could be coming next for healthcare? What is going to be the next widespread area of adoption?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of buzz around the concept of, agentic AI, which is not well defined, but it's kind of what everyone wants, at least in my, again, we're really focused a lot at Align on a lot of the efficiency and productivity things. So we are so part of what we're doing is working with multiple vendors, kind of doing some development with them around very specific use cases, but we're kind of looking at a lot of these platforms that put together the building blocks that I was kind of talking about earlier. So an example would be, you have a complex process within healthcare where you need to do a lot of chart summarization, but then you need to be reaching out and talking to a patient and you need to be doing documentation. So kind of how do we put all of these things together in a way, but then still allow oversight of each of these individual parts. So I think and I would also say, I think we're moving a lot away from the traditional kind of point solutions in healthcare. So, in years and decades past, working in health IT, it was actually just a big frustration is that a lot of the software that we were using were very single-threaded. They're, point solutions for one specific healthcare problem. And while that was difficult on an IT side to kind of manage all of these different things, the oversight of them was much easier because their use cases didn't stray as much. They were kind of one single thing. And now we're moving in a different direction where a lot of these AI platforms are platforms where they can be used across many different use cases, and often are put together to form kind of this idea of an agentic AI. And it's going to be much more of a challenge in terms of oversight and watching for kind of use case creep. But it's also exciting on the other hand, because we're looking at kind of single platforms that will be much more efficient to use across many different use cases.
I agree completely with everything that Britta just said. The other piece that I think we're going to really start seeing in about next 10 years is robotics. Robotics is really coming along at a fast speed, and it's kind of like AI. Like GPT came out in 2018, but no one really heard about it till 2022. So it's so behind the scenes, we're seeing a lot of movement in the robotic space, and I think it'll really get to a pretty impressive state in the next 5 years. To give an example, 2 years ago, no, it's 3 years ago now, Johns Hopkins, they did 3 autonomous surgeries in pigs. So the robot went in autonomously, found a piece of bowel that they inked. They put some ink on it and said, resect this piece. And that's what we do in real life too. Found the inked piece of bowel, stapled it out, put the intestine back together and got out. And that was 3 years ago. So I think we're going to start seeing really interesting uses of robotic AI in healthcare. And I think it's not just going to be like in the clinical space, like can you remove this piece of intestine, for example, or do surgery, but also in like the efficiency space. So there's a robot system called Gary that's out right now that's being used in some hospitals, and Gary will deliver food trays to all the patients in the hospital. Gary will clean the rooms, has like a built-in UV thing that they use, and this interesting arm that drapes over the bed and it mops and all that, or stocking the operating room before surgery the night before, because we stock it for every surgery the night before. So a lot of those things, I think you're going to start seeing more and more robots.
That's very exciting. And my last question was going to be, what are, the biggest opportunities we have? So thanks for kicking us off with that. And I want to just open the floor to the panelists for any last final thoughts as we close up here.
Yeah, I would say you need a strong FDA, a well-informed FDA, and an FDA with, well-resourced to be able to review all these advancements and innovations coming, because, most of the things discussed today were at a level that you would have FDA review, approval, clearance, whatever it might be. And, making sure you can get through FDA timely ensures that the treatments that are developed are delivered timely, because the innovation is so expansive and fast. And so, making sure if you've got these ideas, you've got these technologies, partner with FDA as soon as you can, and, make sure that you're giving them what they need, because ultimately they're that final gate to get into the marketplace and serve patients.
I would say if I had to give a final thought, it's just to appreciate the sort of how quickly AI is developing and how many advancements can happen in such a short period of time, and how our law really legs behind that. And it's, our laws, our case law, and the education and kind of socialization of these issues with our colleagues in the legal department or in the legal profession, and with the public at large. Because ultimately, if cases go to trial or things like that, it's the public that is going to make a lot of the decisions in terms of verdicts and the like. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, is that we're moving at a super rapid pace, and we want to make sure that we're bringing everyone along, because we're all going to be in this together.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I mean, I think we're in a very exciting time and there's a lot of things that can be done, but I also think, we have to just go back to the basics a lot of time and, be reassured that we do know how to kind of have oversight and look into these things and not be so scared that these are systems that are going to run away with things. But we have to really, adhere to the discipline of our best practices and evaluation and a multidisciplinary team to stay on top of these things.
I think that was well summarized. I don't have a lot more to add. I would embrace it, but there's definitely need for more regulation. There's gonna be a lot more in that space going forward.
Great. Thank you all so much for wrapping us up. And thank you to all the speakers who've been here today. Professor Colombo, were you going to close us out? Here we go.
Thank you so much, Molly, for doing a great job. And this was just an outstanding group of speakers. I think we all learned a lot. And the biggest indicator is we had most of the folks that participated, that registered, stuck with us the whole time. So that is a testament to having a very engaging group of speakers. So thank you all so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you with our next event. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.